My name is Lippincott, Executive Director of the Redwood Library, and I'm thrilled to be invited for this special event dedicated to Trinity Church at 300. I mean, it's astounding. We have a lot of signal structures in Newport, Rhode Island. The meeting house, the synagogue, the Redwood itself, but really Trinity. I go around town always saying that the Redwood Library is the anchor institution. I guess I'm lying when I say that. It's really Trinity Church is the anchor institution. And that's why we brought together the big guns to mark this occasion. So first we have Reverend Kelly Brower, and I want to thank you. Before I finish, I want to thank everybody, including Jeff Clark. Where is Jeff Clark? And the entire team from the Redwood Library, Alyssa, Cameron Newby, John Bartosh, of course. And so, but anyways, back to our speakers. We have the Reverend, we have the eminent John Hattendorf. Lippincott, known for his formidable erudition on the history of Newport. And last but not least, Paul Miller, who himself. It is an all-star lineup. And first, we're going to start with Reverend and have her tell us maybe a bit, since she's recently learned this, that she's from Newport. I didn't know this. So she grew up at the church, made some career decisions based on that experience, presumably, then came back. So maybe if you could just tell us a few words about your experience at the church, and then what drew you back to Newport. Obviously, it's your hometown. So.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Megan Kelly Brower, and I am the 32nd fact check rector of Trinity Church, which is a story I could not have expected in my life. And just as Benedict just mentioned, long before I was the rector or even a clergy person, I was a child that walked down to Trinity from Division Street, where I lived with my family. And I loved to sit up in the balcony where I could have just a perfect view of what looked like a patchwork quilt of pews. And I watched priests climb up into the pulpit, and I was a child, so I thought that pulpit was normal. And I thought, that looks like fun. Who doesn't want to get up there? The process to priesthood was a little bit more complicated, but it is a great surprise and joy to be the rector of Trinity, and especially to come in as we're celebrating this tricentennial year. I just want to mention briefly, this past Sunday we celebrated Trinity Sunday at our church, and we had special guests and we had special music, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, which you can look up what that means if you don't know, but it was a big deal. That he came to be with us, and it was a morning for the history book. A really spectacular celebration of 300 years of life in that beautiful building. And then the next morning we gathered in church again, and we had a funeral for a woman in her 70s who had died after a short bout with cancer, and we made space for her husband and her children and her grandchildren as they grieved and prayed and commended her to God. And so we're going to hear so many incredible stories tonight about significant moments of history and people who have impacted our town, our government, our country, our culture, who have encountered or been part of the history of Trinity Church. But for me, the importance of that ministry is always going to be about all of the people who have gone in regular moments to grieve and to celebrate and to pray and to gather and to serve. and to do the best they could to encounter God and to share God's love in this world. But I am delighted to be here with all of you tonight, and thank you so much for coming to hear about our history and celebrate the future.
I failed to mention that John Hattendorf, Professor John Hattendorf, is the curator of the exhibition. So he made the selection of the rare books that are held at the Newport Historical Society. And this is really a sort of collaborative effort with other institutions. So now, John, if you wouldn't mind, he is going to go through the show with the slideshow. And that way you can see all of the selections that he made and for what reasons. And take over.
You can do this better standing up, I think. The idea, as Benedict says, is to give you a kind of virtual gallery talk about what's up here, so you can't all look at it at once. Treasures of Trinity, here. If I get the button to go. There, starting in this thing here, you notice it says belonging to the Library of Rhode Island. Now this is the parish library of Trinity Church, which was the first library in Rhode Island, brought here in 1701 by the Reverend John Lockyer, who came here with these books. And the idea was that if you had a broad library of both theological writings and practical writings and broader history, other things like that, that the people of Rhode Island would see the rationale for the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. That was the rationale for the time. So not just have a narrow view of it, but have everyone, if you knew all the broad knowledge, you'd be an Anglican. This is the idea. The key man in the history of Trinity Church is, well, I don't have a slide of him, but in this little print up here on the left, this is a 1776 or 1774 print of the Reverend James Honeyman, who was a naval chaplain from Scotland, who came here in, first actually came here in 1701 and 1702, when he was the chaplain of a British frigate in Boston, which had been sent over to bring Captain Kidd back for his trial. And Reverend Honeyman made his life's work was ministering to the condemned and to pirates, particularly pirates. So, but he eventually came back, and other people were in between him, but he came and served for almost 50 years here as the rector, and is buried in the churchyard there. But let me talk about, well, this book here, this is from the library. And it's another volume from the same thing, just to show you the different bindings on it. There's a large collection of these books, which are in the Newport. They're on deposit with the Newport Historical Society, if you want to look at here. And this is the vestry minutes from 1709. Another very important figure in the history of the church is Francis Nicholson, who was governor of Maryland, later Virginia, about 4 colonies he was a rector of. And he was the very first major donor to Trinity Church. And he was, during the Queen Anne period, when the church was established, he was a general. And he was very interested in the idea of the colonists capturing Canada for the English. At this time it was French. And so he, through his influence and with the vestry and the rector at Trinity, the church, Trinity, issued a memorial to Her Majesty Queen Anne, congratulating the Queen and the ministry in London for their efforts to try to capture Canada. So, not exactly a religious idea, but it was fighting the French, which in those days was a kind of religious war going on at the time. Can you see it? Yeah. And here, this is the page from the prayer book that was in use at the time of the Revolution. This was a prayer book printed in Oxford in 1771, I believe, and this is where the round area here is the removal of the prayer for the king and replacing it with a prayer for the governor and council of Rhode Island. It's interesting because this is Rhode Island, as you know, declared its independence in May of 1776 before July, but the parish had already gone and changed this in May. But then the state, they were ordered to later do it after they became fully independent. And this shows the binding of this, what the binding looks like. There was both a prayer book, which is what you saw there, and a Bible book, which were both put on the lectern, on the triple pulpit that we have there. But it says, you can see there, Trinity Church, Newport, Rhode Island, 1771, on that version. And this is a sermon given by the Reverend George Bissett. He had come to Newport as a young priest, and he was actually the schoolmaster for Trinity. And he's taught in the school on School Street, obviously. But he was well known for being for his sermons. He was an eloquent preacher. And some of his things, this Solomon Southwick, our famous printer here in town, printed this one, and it's in memory of Mrs. Abigail Wanton, the late consort of Joseph Wanson. And the Wantons, of course, were the people who owned what we call Hunter House today. And they were the ones who enlarged it and made it look in what it looks like, pretty much like today. And he was the rector at the time of the Revolution, and was, well, I'll talk about that in the next one, actually, so it returns to this. This is a sermon that he was planning to give at the time at Trinity Church in late 1779, and just as the British Army was leaving here. But they were rather secretive about when they were leaving. But the rector, who was a loyalist, didn't want to be left behind, so he went on the troop ships to New York on Saturday night before he could give his sermon. But he gave his sermon in New York, and then he gave it again in England and had it printed and sent back here. So. And this is a copy. This is in the post-revolution period, as the church sort of went into decline for a while. There was actually Rhode Island passed laws against Anglicans and Episcopalians, and there were during the war itself those who were the Book of Common Prayer was outlawed, and if you insisted on using it, you were imprisoned. In the Rhode Island's Siberia, Foster Gloucester. And so, which is true. That's right. And we had a few of our parishioners were sent up there as well. But in a later period coming along, this beautiful prayer book here from this, it's a 1760s prayer book printed in Oxford, and it has a beautiful, as you can see it up here, it has a beautiful etching of St. Paul's Cathedral on the frontispiece. But it's signed by one of the members of the Redwood family, who was wanting to help the parish get back to work again. And it was about this time that the first bishop of the United States comes along, George Seabury comes along, and he, of course, becomes the first bishop in Connecticut. But on his way, the way to get to Connecticut is to stop in Newport, get off the ship, and then go to Connecticut. We tried to talk him into being the rector of Trinity, but he said no deal, and went on to be the first bishop in America, as well as the Bishop of Connecticut. And this is an interesting case here. This is Rector DeHaan, Theodore DeHaan. He's giving a talk here in Newport. Just as the news, he gave a sermon on receiving the news of the death of George Washington. And it's actually two events together, but this is the publication of that. He has the Masonic Lodge, the Society, and the Newport Guards, which I think is different than Newport Artillery Company, but there are two different groups. But it was a huge funeral service was held in Trinity for this, and there was even an empty coffin for George, who was taken from Trinity and carried up to Farewell Street and symbolically buried up there after the funeral service at Trinity. So one of the interesting things that happened in following George Washington's death. And this is what I say. This is the oration of the Society of the Cincinnati. If you go into the other room, you'll see things about the founding of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is the group of officers, mainly Army officers, some naval officers, who had served throughout the Revolution. And there are 13 state societies and one in France of these things. And the first president was Major General Nathaniel Greene, who lived at the time when it was founded, lived over here on Mill Street. A house that he rented. But I wanted to point out, not the title page, but the first side here, you'll see there's a man, here is the secretary of the society, was a man named Robert Rogers. He was not only that, he was a well-known school teacher. He had been an Army officer. He's the namesake of Rogers High School, and a prominent character and librarian of this institution. If you go into the Harrison room there, up on the left on the second portrait, you'll see a portrait of him in there. So an important figure that hardly anybody remembers. I don't think my children who went to Rogers ever realized that it was named for a Revolutionary War officer in the Army. Even the school says it's mainly a teacher. And this is the manuscript. As you know, if you've been inside Trinity, you know it has numbered pews, and those pews were private property, and you had to buy them. They were actually sometimes some of the pew records are mixed up in the land evidence records in City Hall rather than in the church records. This was a system that was used to raise money. They didn't pass the plate in those days. To get donations, but you invested in the church by buying the pew, and then you paid an annual tax on that. And the prices for the pews varied from what you could pay. And this system lasted up until it was still going in the 20th century, by the middle of the 20th century. It was very hard to get rid of because people didn't want to let go of their pew. As you know, people always want to stay in the same pew. I'm guilty. So, but this is an example of, this is a man, what a deed looked like. And in this case, this is the pew that Clement C. Moore, the author of A Night Before Christmas, bought from Elizabeth Perry, the widow of Oliver Hazard Perry. So there was amazing connections even in the administrative sides of things here. And this is a note, Jeff found this when he was looking around in Aardvark. They had this note from Cornelius Vanderbilt writing to the treasurer of Trinity Church saying, yeah, okay, I remember you asked me 2 years ago to give you $1,000. Yeah, I'm going to do it. Here it is in this envelope, and this is the note that Cornelius sends to give this donation. Of course, at this point, this is the 1870s. He was just purchased in the previous year had the breakers, but it was then the wooden Lorillard estate, not the breakers that we think of today. So we're grateful that that Aardvark has loaned this to the original document to the exhibit. And in the the bicentenary, of course, the Queen was here, and we had the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as part of that visit, we were given a large Bible, which in there is the Queen's signature and the signature of Donald Coggan, who was then the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that is the end of that here. But I should mention, of course, that it's on Queen. The church is on Queen Anne Square, and we have the paten and chalice that were given to the church in 1704 during Queen Anne's reign. The main feature, of course, is the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, which was supporting these colonial churches, and it has since known all over the world in the Anglican Communion for giving a chalice and paten to every church in the world, it seems, Anglican church, but we were the very first. And I found it in the rectors in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the documentation for that. So I think that probably, I've talked too much, so I'll let that go.
God's going to tell us actually a fascinating history of the connection of the Redwood family and the Redwood Library to the church. So, Bert, thank you.
Thank you. So, connections between the Redwoods and Trinity. The Redwood family comes to New England from Bristol, England, and Abraham Redwood Sr. is a merchant. He's headquartered in Newport and Salem and Antigua because his first wife was the heir to a huge plantation in Antigua called Casa de Gardens. He was a Quaker. There was a lot of Quaker agitation down in Antigua early on, and he brought the Quaker religion up to New England. He adopted the Quaker religion that had started up in New England. And he died in Salem, and his son Abraham Jr. Came down to Newport and ultimately inherited the Newport properties as well as the Antigua plantations. Abraham Jr. was a birthright Quaker. However, he was not terribly interested in pursuing that denomination. He made a great deal of money. He had big fancy houses, very, very fine clothes, and he just sort of ignored his Quaker faith, up to the point where the elders of the Quaker meeting said, well, you're not conforming to a lot of our requirements. So he was disowned from the meeting. He died in the 1780s and is buried on Coggeshall Avenue in his wife's family home, the family cemetery. She was a Coggeshall. All of his sons became loyalists, Trinity Church members, and ultimately moved to England. So a combination of upward mobility and having family members marry into the church helped move the Redwood family into the Church of England. One daughter married the daughter of Francis Pope. Francis Pope was one of the founders and was Abraham Redwood's major sea captain. And another daughter married, son married the daughter of Reverend James Honeyman. And they had children. One's daughter Hannah buried in the Trinity Churchyard. So the Abraham Redwood's sons moved to England and stayed there and flourished in wealthy lifestyles and members of churches of England in London. One small branch of the family returned to America and settled in Flushing, New York. And he was a merchant, and that family moved down to the Carolinas. And ultimately, the Redwood name pretty much fizzles out in America. There may be one or two left, even to this day, in descent from the Redwoods of Newport. But that's sort of the connection to Trinity Church from a Quaker convert.
More or less. No, in listening to both John and Bert, I think what's fascinating is that there's this general misconception that the Anglican Church was always established from 1639 on in Newport, and it overlooks the fact that it really was quite a struggle to get the church established, and it was almost a bit of missionary activity.
That's right.
Newport, as you probably realize, was a hotbed of nonconformists, and still is, and the community was really creating their own sort of religious rituals and rites. In fact, the first Anglican service, I think, in New England was in Boston, but only in 1687. So the creation of Trinity by the close of the decade was really quite a lively experiment. Anglicans, of course, thought that the Baptists, the Quakers, the Congregationalists of Newport were living in darkness. They were quite happy, of course, to be free from the strictures of the established church. But it's interesting when you compare it with what the French and the Spaniards were doing. As of their first settlements in the New World, there was always a Franciscan friar following to start up a mission, or in France, the Jesuits were very active. In the English colonial system, there was no rigorous enforcement of conformity for the state religion. In fact, there was no Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts until 1701. So a good 80 years after the founding of most of the New England settlements. And the whole creation of Trinity Church is not what you might think. It's not like the landed socially superior classes of Maryland or Virginia who always had an established church from 1620s on in the southern colonies. In New England, obviously, that simply didn't exist. So I'd like to put a face to some of the names, the portrait rather primitive in Benedict's eyes, but it is a primitive portrait of about 1680 of one of the most active advocates and founders of Trinity Church, a man named Gabriel Bernon, or Gabriel Bernon in Rhode Island. And that brings to mind a few street names in Newport. Ayrault, Leroy, were all members of Bernon's immediate family or followers, as were the family named Godard, the Goddards, the, who am I forgetting? I'm sure there are lots, the Ayraults. Ayrault was an in-law of Gabriel Bernon. And why, as French Huguenots who came to New England after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, why would they be interested in supporting and founding an Anglican congregation? Well, it's really out of loyalty and thanks to the Crown. You probably realize that when the revocation of the Edict of Nantes took place, thousands upon thousands of wealthy, talented French craftsmen, bankers, financiers fled to Germany, a greater number to Amsterdam, and then after Amsterdam they moved on generally to London. and that was the profile of Gabriel Bernon. He was imprisoned in 1685. He'd made a sizable fortune for himself in pelts in Quebec, and also in trade in the West Indies. So he was a bit of a very visible target for the authorities in La Rochelle. He fled to Amsterdam and London, and while in London, he heard about a land grant in a godforsaken corner of Massachusetts, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony called Oxford. He decided to put some venture capital forward. He was granted 750 acres. He got together a ship of about 75 Huguenot families that he knew from La Rochelle. He funded their voyage. They arrived in Boston in 1688, and they all trooped up to the royal authorities and said, "We'd like to become naturalized subjects of the king." So that oath of loyalty to the king, I think, inspired them in their own path to the Anglican Church. That, together with the fact that the Calvinist rite, as they discovered it in 1680s Boston, was extremely severe. It had very little in the way of ritual. As you probably know, the Puritans banned Christmas. All of this was new to the cosmopolitan French Huguenots. So slowly but surely they began to be tempted by Anglicanism, and Bernon decides to leave Boston. His colony in New Oxford, Massachusetts, outside Worcester, unfortunately fell victim to Indian raids and was definitively abandoned by 1704. So Bernon comes to Newport with lots of financial projects. He partners with Mr. Ayrault, and they continue their trade with the West Indies very successfully. But in 1699, he gathers together 16 signatures from friends who have been a brave and almost secret underground group of Anglicans that had been meeting in each other's houses. They decided to petition the royal authorities that they requested the establishment of an Anglican church in Newport and the arrival of a priest to administer to their needs. It was luckily through Bernon's political and financial connections that petition was favorably processed, and indeed the church begins by 1699, and the rest is history. But it's a fascinating saga, and not at all, I think, what you might have assumed through the usual stereotypes. It's not establishment. It's practically a group of underground co-religionaires who decide to create a brave new adventure. So that's what I wanted to bring up primarily.
That's great.
I think our speakers will take a few questions. Everybody raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone. Okay, we're done.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Paul, maybe you have a question for the professor.
Okay.
Come on.
What would you like to talk about?
All right, I got a question
Okay.
for Paul.
Uh-oh.
So Newport was founded in 1639. Was there a religious motivation behind whoever came down here to originally settle Newport?
Yeah, there was a group called the Anabaptists led by Anne Hutchinson who settled initially in Portsmouth, and then there were some internal disagreements amongst themselves, and a band of men decided to, whose names you know, they're immortalized in every corner of Newport. They decided to settle on the harbor because it was a natural harbor. It had a better economic potential, but it was also to get away from Anne Hutchinson, who ended up, as you probably know, hearing that she was about to be pursued by the royal authorities. So she went off to the wilds of Queens and was scalped by the Indians on the site of the Hutchinson Parkway on the way into New York. So that was the original group, so they were Baptists, and then obviously joined pretty early on by Congregationalists, and then first and foremost, the Quakers.
Thank you.
Let me take that right here. I can start out and
Go ahead.
the design of the church is, we believe, taken from the ideas of Christopher Wren, which is an earlier church architect in London, who was busy after the fire of London. So that when the Trinity is built here, it's not the latest designs. The latest architecture is people like Gibbs and others who are working in London. That's sort of the next phase. But we have, like so many things in the colonies, they're looking at pattern books, at illustrations, so that the people who are doing the Old North Church in Boston and here, the founding of Trinity is closely associated, at least the clergy were closely associated between the Old North Church and Trinity. And their church looks very much like ours, except that it's more like the original in London, which have a basic brick foundation or stone walls to it, while we're entirely wood here. So that's the basic difference. There's no particular church that anyone has been able to identify that it's a model of. It's just inspired by that approach and perhaps certain design features within it.
I recollect it's been quite a while since I've been here, but some of your windows were funded by quite well-known families.
I didn't hear.
The windows were funded by well-known families. We do have 5 stained glass windows. We have several of our Trinity tour guides in the room, as well as Dr. Hattendorf, who knows all of these things. So 5 stained glass windows, 2 of them are Tiffany windows, one dedicated to Cornelius Vanderbilt, and offhand,
I can't remember the other one.
families, if any of our tour guides do.
And those were, of course, later. They come in the roughly 1890 period. There was a window over the altar, which is now at the south end of what was K Chapel, but it does survive. But it was moved out in the 1920s when they were returning the church to a more colonial look to it. So there was no stained glass in the colonial period, and you can still see some of the original glass in the windows. If you see the sort of curvature and the refraction on some of the when the sun's quite in the right way.
Wasn't there a Trinity Church building prior to the current Trinity Church?
Sorry.
Is there
Wasn't there a Trinity Church building prior to?
Yes, this is the second This is the second building. No, it was in operation while this church was being built. The current church took 2 years to build, and it was we think it looked something like the church over in Warwick, or not Warwick, Wickford. It probably looked something like that. But it was when they finished this church in 1726. They dismantled it, put it on a barge, and sent it over to the other side of the bay, where it was reconstructed again and was put into use. And then for a couple of years later, they decided to build another church, and so going to be sent somewhere else. And it was they finished dismantling it late in the summer, and they put it on a barge to tow it somewhere. And as usual, we had a hurricane, and all the pieces of this church were blown away and disappeared in the bay. So we don't know any, we can't find any evidence of it at all. Is it called?
This is for anyone. Are there any, especially colonial era, early public period intersections between Trinity, Redwood, and Truro Synagogue?
Sorry, what?
Can you say it again?
Sorry. Especially in this time period, any intersections between Truro Synagogue, Redwood Library, and Trinity Parish?
I'm not sure about, there certainly was, I mean, the religious leaders of all those churches were known to each other and very much involved. Truro was certainly a well-known character in town, and Stiles and others, and the people at Trinity, and many of them actually, when in the founding of what later has become Brown University, it was the College of Rhode Island and the College of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, as it was originally done, which was founded here in Newport, down on the square, or the original document was signed here. But the original idea was to have at a multi-religious institution. But the Baptists didn't like that after a while, and they took control. But so the rector of Trinity, other people were part of that, and as were the synagogue and other leaders were in that, and they were all also connected with the Redwood. When the Redwood was founded, the religious leaders were asked what kind of books we needed here, and as you know, the original collection came as one shipment. What you can see the remnants of it, or almost the whole thing, in the Harrison room. But they were all asked their advice as to what books would be in there. So there was a connection, and there were discussions, certainly.
Any other questions?
How many other churches, Anglican, were built at the same time that the current structure was built?
The Old North Church is the closest one, certainly in Boston. As I said, we started construction on the church. Both churches started at the same time. We, of course, had funding problems, and so we took a little longer to finish ours. But the wealthier people in Boston finished quickly.
And how many craftsmen were involved in the building of Trinity Church?
I don't know. I've found no records on the actual construction of it, and I found no records, and I thought for a while that there may have been, that Boston people may have come down and been involved in the building of Trinity, but there's no evidence of it, and I've gone through the records in Boston and in the Massachusetts Diocese, as well as the Old North Church. There's just no records that can tell me what, nor is there any records to tell us how many slaves were involved or black people were involved in the construction.
But in order to establish an after Trinity Church, just to give you an idea, there was St. Paul's and Narragansett, Baltimore, West St. John's, and Providence, and those were all also big projects that we had really early on.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the central pulpit and the design of having that between the congregation and the altar? Is there a precedent for that?
Well, I just started, but it's a common kind of design in the period. In the Victorian period, almost every one of them was moved aside so that people could see what's going on the altar. My theory is that in Newport, we were competing with the Congregationalists and all the other people here whose emphasis was on sermons and readings from the Bible, and that's why they kept it. They didn't move it. There's a similar pulpit in Williamsburg, for example, and other places. You can see remnants of. You can see them in England as well, in the churches there.
There's also, it's not freestanding, but the Seventh-day Baptist Meeting House behind the Historical Society, by the same architect, Richard Monday, has a pedestal pulpit with a stairway going up, and very similar to the Trinity pulpit, as well as the tablets above the pulpit and above the minister's seats. A lot of similar features to Trinity in that meeting house.
And there were, I think, as John mentioned, there were several other churches that had center pulpits like that, but at the time, Eucharist wasn't a weekly or even monthly practice necessarily. And so lots of churches relocated their pulpits when the Eucharist became more prevalent as part of their worship practice, but Trinity never did, and now I say we never will. I can tell you it's an interesting experience to stand behind the pulpit. I mean, behind the altar and look at the back of the pulpit while you are celebrating the Eucharist.
We had of course, the canopy over it is not really a decorative thing. It's the sounding board. It's the old speaker system that came with the church, and famously or infamously, we had a rector who was afraid that thing was going to fall on him, and so he wanted to take it out, and actually he did take it out, and the congregation says that goes back or you go forever. So that's one of the reasons why I think that the current bottom of it is flat. I think it probably looked more like what you see underneath the one at the Sabbatarian Meeting House, or in the balcony of the Colony House, are all done by the same builder. And in the pews in the back of the room, there's a kind of a Union Jack shape of the wood. So I suspect that was what was under that originally, rather than a flat thing.
My question basically is, as a child, I remember walking by that church and seeing the cemetery, and my thought was, those must be the people that founded that church. Now, at 8 or 9 years old, what did I know, right? But now when I think about it, and even on the tour that I once took, who do you think was the most valuable person? Ooh, not even 2 or 3, that made sure that the architecture was giving their community what they wanted and needed. Because I'm telling you, what they thought about the future is why it is what it is now.
I think certainly the design of the church was influenced by the clergy meeting with the people, the Boston clergy meeting with our clergy here. And there was a pretty nasty fight between the clergy from Boston, who wanted to take control of this church, and the ministers would fight against each other. And James Honeyman is known would lock each other out and hide the chalices and this sort of stuff, so the other people couldn't operate. And that occurred before 1707, and which is one reason why we don't have any records of the church before 1707 here in Newport. Except I found them all in Lambeth Palace in London, because this fight that went on as to what the church should look like was referred to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, and in the archives in England you can find the full story. So.
One of the people who helped bankroll it currently was Godfrey Malone, a merchant from Virginia, and he
fell.
Can you speak to the reason why Trinity was spared during the United States Revolution, the American Revolution? And then a little bit about the Trinity and the connection with Hunter House and his funeral. And how that
Well, the church was the garrison church for the occupying British Army, which is why it was saved. The other churches were being used as hospitals. A lot of the pews and inside parts of the church were being ripped up. There was a great shortage of wood and for heating in the cold New England weather. It was all over, actually all over the area in America during the war. And this became a crisis in logistics for the British Army. But they were using, in Newport, they were using the insides of the congregational churches and the other churches in town for firewood and even dismantling houses for this sort of thing. But there is a published record of a Scottish officer who was here and that talks about being marched down to Trinity Church to his services. I don't know if they came every Sunday or just rotated here, but he talks about mentions the organ, and Bishop Barclay was here, and these colonial girls are not so bad, is what he says. Typical soldier, you know. So.